A new study has revealed that South Africa's counter-trafficking initiatives have stalled or lost ground due to the coronavirus pandemic, among other factors. The Human Science Research Council's study on human trafficking in South Africa reveals that despite a possible 250,000 victims in South Africa alone, there's limited success to the prosecution of traffickers. We speak to the author of the study now, Professor Frankel, for more. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. Perhaps help us understand how the study was conducted.
Well, I've been in the trafficking field now for about 10 years, and in 2016, 2017, I wrote my first book on human trafficking in South Africa. And then approximately 2 years ago, I decided I needed to update what was in that original volume because quite a bit had in fact changed. So, yeah, for the last 2 years I've been working on this, and it's now thankfully come to conclusion. And, yeah, there's some interesting revelations in its pages.
Some of those include child organ trafficking, illegal adoption and baby farming of children for exploitation by foster parents. Interested in the illegal adoption and baby farming of children for exploitation by foster parents, what does that mean?
Well, you know, most books on trafficking focus on 3 or 4 things, namely child trafficking for sexual purposes, or commercial trafficking of women, organ trafficking, and also labor trafficking. What I do in my book is try to expand into a greater number of trafficking modalities. So I look at illegal adoption, which is widespread in South Africa, and it's obviously not something which can easily be measured. I look at organ trafficking of children, which is not only a South African phenomenon, but is also a Southern African phenomenon. And I look at some systems of fostering, many of which are culturally driven, but lead to situations where children are abused and exploited by their foster parents. So, yeah, I've tried to get to forms of child trafficking in particular, which are not normally looked at in the normal literature.
You also argue that the successful prosecution of traffickers is minimal, despite a possible 250,000 victims in this country alone. Why is that?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The assertion that successful prosecution of traffickers is minimal, despite a possible 250,000 victims in South Africa alone. What did you find in terms of why there is minimal prosecution?
Well, if one looks, for example, at contemporary reporting on human trafficking, you find that at any one time there are perhaps no more than 100 people who are being charged with human trafficking. Of those 100, perhaps 50 or 60 get to court. Of those 60 or 70, perhaps 10 to 15, maybe 20 will actually be convicted and sentenced seriously. Obviously, there are a lot of problems here, but basically 2 things are of particular importance. The one is that South African society, and in fact societies throughout the world, including other places in Africa, live in a kind of environment where human trafficking is not seen as part of the list of criminal acts. It's a culture of perhaps a culture of silence wrapped around human trafficking. The result is that when people do come across human trafficking, they don't report it. So that's one side of the problem, this culture of tolerance, if you like. The other side, of course, is that we have one of the best trafficking laws in the world. It's a highly progressive law, which dates back in operation to about 2015, 2016. But unfortunately, there are high levels of corruption in the police force, or if not corruption, complicity, or if not complicity, lack of knowledge at station level as to what trafficking is. So basically what we have here is a culture of impunity. People are trafficked, and yet very little is actually done to stop them.
how to break this culture of silence or tolerance, because one of the recommendations is to have a widespread awareness campaign, and that should include teachers, learners, social workers and psychologists. What is it that the everyday person needs to look out for to identify that something is going on here?
Well, look, public intelligence or public information, if you like, is always very, very important in alerting the police to acts of trafficking, or to alerting social workers for that matter. But in order to have that done, I think you need a huge amount of public education. As I said, there's a culture of silence wrapped around trafficking. So people often see trafficking, but they don't recognize trafficking. And what some of the groups that you mentioned a few minutes ago need to have is to be armed, let's say, with an understanding of what trafficking is and what one would do about it if you encounter it. For example, social workers and psychologists, not necessarily in South Africa, but in other countries, have what you might call red flag training, so that if they come across a person who displays certain physical and emotional characteristics, there's a good chance that person has been trafficked. So we need to spread what you might call a kind of system of recognition more widely throughout the country. Having said that, I think one should add that, of course, South Africa, in the urban areas, though, I think it's considerably easier. It has been done, but it needs to be done on a much wider and more systematic basis.
Does that then mean that human trafficking is more prevalent in rural areas?
Well, we don't know. I mean, one of the big problems with trafficking, and it's obviously the first question that most people ask me, is how much trafficking is there? And the fact of the matter is we don't know. We don't know how much trafficking there is in South Africa or in Africa or in the rest of the world. We work with kind of guesstimate figures, for example. And that's an enormous problem to deal with these guesstimates, because trafficking is very deeply rooted. It's a very underground crime. It's often confused by law enforcement with rape and gender-based violence. So we don't know how much trafficking is actually out there. The figure that I've used comes from various international sources, but I would be dishonest if I said it couldn't be an extra 30,000 or it could be less than 30,000 there. So, yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, because how do you tackle something you don't know? Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this afternoon.